while his help still did not come up from the south for the next 3 days. From July 13th to July 16th, his men went out on patrol. Usually they encountered some of the enemy, and a few shots were exchanged during the whole period. Lived lost, 1 man killed and 1 man wounded on both sides. The sparring was cautious. General Sasaki's troops were busy digging in for the assault against Boko, that they expected they were also preparing a counterattack against General Hester's force between Liana and Zanana. The Japanese referred to this area as the Sho River, and this is where General Sasaki planned to attack on July 13th. The staff officer from Sasaki's headquarters handed Colonel Tominari his orders. The 13th Infantry Regiment with all speed will move to the Sho River upper stream area, where the 169th Regiment was bogged down. You will disembark Mark on the shore in the Suzumo vicinity west of Zanana and make a flank attack on the enemy's main force to destroy the pressure on the shore after this. Immediately you will move to the upper water of the Sho River in the Fuja Bridge area and relieve the troops of the 229th Regiment there. You will secure the river crossing and then destroy the enemy's main force in the upper river region. You will be accompanied by a platoon of engineers to the Sho River crossing, and they will be responsible for your crossing. Then you will leave the Sugi Artillery Reserve Corps in command of the Fueta Bridge and through the wireless squad as well as the telegraph squad. You will report on these actions to this headquarters following these orders. The 13th Infantry began to move out from the plantation area near Munda on July 14th. 1 company left at Tanam. This advanced guard would move first to the Sho River upper stream crossing mentioned in the orders. They were to scout the enemy and report on the topography, and after that the attack plans would be made final except for wireless communication from this point on the unit was to be out of touch with General Sasaki's headquarters. There was no way that Sasaki could be in touch with them because the distance was too great, but he was not dismayed. He had every confidence in Colonel Tomonari and the picked troops that made up the 13th Regiment on July 14th and 15 headquarters had 2 sets of situation reports. The regiment reached the operational area and made contact with the enemy. Colonel Tomonari reported then that something strange was going on in the Renova Bay area. A large force was being brought over to the Sho River Zanana. What this meant, Colonel Tomonari was not quite sure, but it seemed to him that the time had come to strike. That message was sent at 7:29 on the morning of July 14th, and General Sasaki agreed. He sent off a message to Rabaul with a dupe addressed to Buan, just in case the rabble message was not picked up, and he gave details of his new plan for an offensive. He announced that the time had come for the offensive to stop the enemy's build-up and destroy the beachhead at Zanana and Liana. This was the psychological moment to attack. He said it must be done within the next 10 days, or the defense of New Georgia was in jeopardy, and for the second time the Japanese would suffer tragedy. He was obviously referring here to Guadalcanal, and the error of sending too little too late that had cost the Japanese that island. What General Sasaki wanted was not just permission to attack. He already had that. What he wanted was massive air and naval support plus more troops. The messages went off, but they were never acknowledged. Apparently neither one was picked up. So General Sasaki's new plan of attack was never revealed to Rabaul, and no support was to be forthcoming at the outset. Meanwhile, General Sasaki was having just about as much trouble with his local communications after a few days' rest. The men of the 13th Regiment were pronounced ready to face fire again, and they moved out. Major Kuda's 3rd Battalion set off on July 14th for the Zanana area, and they began crossing the mountains up one hill and down the dale, the never-ending, slogging along in dense jungle. All the way, the Major soon found that the map he had was of no use, and they navigated by compass heading east. Colonel Lived's men continued to organize the ground in the American Northern Forces area. Every night they were bombed by Washing Machine Charlie, which meant one or more of the Japanese float planes from the shortlands. Sometimes there were a few casualties, and for the most part the bombs knocked down palm trees. Colonel Lived waited, but the Japanese failed to make a pass at his roadblock along the Bisiko Munda Trail, and he did not realize that the enemy had begun using shortcuts. It was certainly true that the roadblock had been useful in preventing the Japanese from reinforcing the Inagi garrison when Lived was attacking it, But it had not cut off supplies to Munda, as he hoped at the end of this time the roadblock forces were withdrawn to Tree, and for a week planes had been supplying them by air, but most of the supplies went into the jungle, and a lot of them were recovered by the Japanese. Since nothing much was happening, it seemed best to bring the men up to safety. On July 15th, the wounded were moved to Inagi, whence they could more easily be evacuated to Guadalcanal. The roadblock was abandoned, and Colonel Livard waited for his reinforcement. It never came. Finally, Major General Oscar Griswold, the commander of the 14th Corps, announced to General Millard Harmon H's ground forces commander that Hester would have to have another division of troops to move forward on New Georgia. The fact was that the assault had been bollocked up more thoroughly than any maneuver in the South Pacific. To that date, General Hester had split his regiments, one taking the upper trail and one staying along the coast. Finally, on July 13th, the badly mauled 172nd Infantry did reach Lana, but then General Sasaki, who knew the terrain, moved a battalion of the Imperial Army's 13th Infantry in between the two American regiments. The 169th was cut off deep in the jungle, and its supply were exhausted. The troops were subsisting on airdrops, with many of the bundles falling into the hands of the enemy. When Admiral Holly had the word that more troops were essential, he sent General Harmon up to New Georgia to find out exactly what was going on when Harmon arrived. He was dismayed at the state of morale of the two regiments and the confusion of General Hester's command virtually on the spot. He relieved General Hester, and he told Griswold that in the absence of any other, the Corps commander would also have to take over the assault force. The problem, as it would be again, was the inadequate training of the Army troops assigned to the New Georgia operation in the beginning of the South Pacific battle. Admiral Turner had employed the Marines. They had been trained for this sort of warfare, particularly the Raider battalions indeed at San Diego. The Navy maintained an amphibious school, and out of this would come Major General Holland Smith to take over the Central Pacific Invase, the Army troops. General MacArthur's command accepted had been trained for European-type operations, as the Navy claimed its men had been given training on Guadalcanal, but that was minimal, and obviously it was not as well done as it should have been. The officers of the New Georgia assault force were not as expert and confident as they should have been in their war history of the South Pacific. The Japanese make much of the powerful effect their noise and confusion tactics waked on the enemy at New Georgia. When General Griswold took tactical command at New Georgia, he saw that he needed fresh troops from Guadalcanal, and he estimated that it would take 10 days to get the offensive going again. He began moving troops into the Zanana area as rapidly as possible, and this activity was the subject of Colonel Tomari's report of July 14th. That day the 3rd Battalion had its difficulties. Major Kuda set out from the plantation area with his map, and assuming that it would be an easy march, but he found no trail, and although he heard shooting, he saw nothing, and soon the battalion was lost. Kuda tried to get oriented by using a compass, but even that was not very satisfactory. He and his men kept coming back to points they had already passed. They really did not know where they were until suddenly, quite by accident, through a clearing. In the jungle, the major caught the sound of surf, and then they saw below them a dense mangrove swamp. The seacoast must be nearby. The battalion made a 90-degree turn off its old course, and after an hour's walk the troops found themselves on a hill overlooking the seashore below them. Not 100 feet away, they could see half a dozen American troops. They must be near the American landing area, and they found Colonel Tomonari and reported as night approached. They assumed their defensive positions, so that they would not be surprised on the evening before their attack by a night counterattack from the Americans. At 5 o'clock that evening, the battalion leaders went to the regimental command post to get their orders from Colonel Tomonari for the next day's action. It was July 16th, 2 more days after Colonel Tomari's request to stage the attack, before the permission came, and the wheels were put in motion during that time. Although the colonel was moving his force into position, the Americans did not even know he was there. The 1st Battalion would kick off from its bivouac area, and the 3rd Battalion would deploy to the right to cover the flank of the main attack until it was launched, and then join. The time was set for 6 o'clock, just as the sun was setting, and the fortified positions of the 229th Regiment were all around them. The enemy knew there were Japanese troops up the hill, and as the evening came, the artillery began to fire on the hills. At a signal, the men of the 13th Regiment began to move forward, crawling and creeping with their heads down. It was rough country, covered with century plants, whose spikes stung their cheeks as they moved along. When the 1st Battalion had reached a point about 100 feet from the American lines, they were discovered, and rifles and automatic weapons began to open up. Still, Colonel Tominari did not get up. Now the heavy cloud cover that had moved around the island all day long began to spill rain-heavy showers that drenched friend and foe alike. During one of these downpours, Colonel Tominari decided the psychological moment had come and gave the order attack. The first up was a platoon leader of the 2nd Battalion Cadet in Sayachi, and he charged forward until he was shot down the Japanese lost men. But this attack was a success. The 13th Regiment had driven the Americans back, causing them to leave tanks, machine guns, and scores of 155 artillery pieces in their wake. Among other things, the Japanese captured a Supply D, which was more than welcome because they were cut off from their own supplies by the speed with which they had marched and the constant interdicting action of the American air forces, but now they were resupplied with food. At least that night the troops spent clearing out the old enemy battle camp and making it habitable for themselves. Act 1 in the drama of the 13th Infantry's mission had been successfully completed. The weather continued to be stormy, and the 13th Regiment was out of touch with General Sasak headquarters for several days during this period. The American artillery and air forces did what General Hester's infantry had been unable to do. They kept the Japanese at bay. The constant bombardment and bombing by American planes was hard on morale. That first major attack had left the elements of the division badly scattered, and it was all Colonel Tominari could do to bring them together again under the heavy impact of the American fire. But the Japanese held the positions on the night of July 17th. Colonel Tominari staged another attack against the American troops on the shore. By this time, the 43rd United States Army Division had arrived, and its command post was located not far from Zanana. Colonel Tominari ordered the new attack. It was carried out in the same manner as the first, and before the Americans knew it, the Japanese were inside the perimeter and inside the command post. Repairs, and she had been in battle, but the results were muddy. Who and what had been out there in the air and on the sea were not known to captain or crew. This is the way it was night after night in Kula Gulf. As Americans and Japanese set out simultaneously to reinforce their positions and yet prevent the enemy from doing the same at 1 o'clock op the morning of July 18th. After their wild ride, the 4th Raiders arrived at Inagi Inlet. The reinforcement did not mean as much as it seemed, because Karin's unit arrived 200 men short. The destroyer transports that brought the Marines in also took all the wounded and sick men out, and when all heads were counted, Colonel Livard did not have many more men than he had begun with in the Rice anchorage. Landing still, Livard was itching to get moving, and he called a conference of his battalion commanders, 2 Marine and 2 Army, and that afternoon made plans for an assault on Boko, the Japanese port of entry for reinforcements from Kolombangara. Tentatively, he scheduled the attack for July 20th, and to soften up Barocco he asked for and got air attack. The Japanese positions were bombed and strafed by aircraft from Guadalcanal on July 19th, but for that matter, so was Inagi bombed twice on the evening of the 19th. In the first raid, 9 men were hit. None was hit in the second raid that day, Liversedge embroidered. The plan gave each battalion its instructions and issued verbal orders that they could mull over while the written orders were prepared. They were to be ready to move out at 7:30 a.m. on July 20th, and on July 20th, Colonel Livard started his offensive against Barocco on the right hand, or north were the troops of the 1st Raider Battalion, and the 4th Raider Battalion on the left was the 3rd Battalion of the Army, 148th Infantry. The 3rd Battalion of the Army, 145th Infantry, was left back at Inagi in reserve. Livard's drive ran up against the Japanese at about 10:15 a.m. He found that the enemy had made good use of the time when the Americans had been held up waiting for reinforcement. The Japanese had built imp placements of coral and logs, and had dug in behind them. The positions were constructed with an eye to crossfire. and snipers had taken to the coconut palms above, where they sat quietly, their camouflaged uniforms enhanced with bits of palm frond and dirt that broke the human silhouette. As the Americans came up, the Japanese opened up with machine guns and mortars, and the snipers began their work. Colonel Livard quickly discovered that he had moved into a hornet's nest. The Japanese defense was 4 tiers deep, with interconnecting trenches the Americans approached with enormous firepower, and the D of automatic weapons was deafening. One observer who had been at Bloody Ridge on Guadalcanal swore that the volume of fire at BCTO was more intensive. Livard's troops discovered the extent of the Japanese defences when they breached the first line, only to find that the second line was as strong. They broke through the second line at 2:30 that afternoon, after Livard had committed his local reserves, the 4th Raiders, and half the demolition platoon. The position looked good on high ground within view of Barocco harbour, but there were 2 more lines of defence to be broken, and here Livard began to run into real trouble. At 3:47 a.m. Livard asked for the last of the reserves. He was ready to make his final push. The Japanese seemed to be on the run, and many were seen without weapons, and he figured he could take the point in short order, and then, controlled by Barocco harbour, the move looked a lot easier than it turned out to be. And one reinforced platoon began to move up to the west along the narrow spit north of Leland Lagoon. They moved forward as far as the west end of the lagoon, but there they were, stuck held down by mortar and rifle grenade knee mortar fire. Actually, the knee mortar was not a rifle grenade, but a true small-caliber mortar designed to be operated by a single infantryman. The long, narrow tube handled an ordinary Japanese grenade, and at 3:30 a.m. the Japanese began their counter-move with something. The Americans did not expect it started with a heavy 90 mm mortar barrage on all units, and especially the command post. The Americans began to take more casualties than Livard had expected. He could not reply in kind. He had no heavy mortars by 5 o'clock. The last of his reserves had been committed, and he was no further ahead than he had been an hour before. It was remarkable the Japanese were pinned into a small defensive perimeter, not more than 300 yards from east to west and 600 yards from north to south. But those 90 mm mortars were fired with speed and accuracy, and without apparent regard for expenditure of ammunition. Shortly after 5 p.m. the American left flank reported that a Japanese counterattack seemed to be building up. Livard continued the firefight until 5:15 p.m., and then decided he was getting nowhere. He moved the casualties out and gave orders to withdraw to the high ground 500 yards east of the harbour. Half an hour later the withdrawal was underway, with the Americans losing some ammunition, but saving all weapons and all their wounded. The walking wounded, 80 of them, began the long trek back to Ngai, a mile away. 2 companies of the 4th Raiders covered the withdrawal and stayed up on the high ground until 6 p.m. when they were ordered back to Inagi. They returned reporting that just before they left, 2 barges loaded with Japanese reinforcements entered by Barocco harbour. They were just the first of the small boats to come. In the Japanese stream of reinforcements had not even been slowed down as night fell. Colonel Livard had a report from Lieutenant Colonels Emkaff and Schultz, who had been sent off that same day with a column to move around to Triai and then down to Barocco to flank the Japanese and support Livard. They had run into a strong Japanese force 3 miles outside Tree and had been pinned down. Livard ordered them to dig in for the night. He then counted noses. He had lost 49 men killed, 206 wounded, and 1 man missing. The 4th Raiders had taken the worst beating with 205 casualties. They had reported 33 dead Japanese, but that was all they knew about the defender casualties. The attack had been anything but a success. There was no way Livard could attain his objective without substantial reinforcement. On July 21st, the wounded were evacuated by 3 PB from Guadalcanal after Livard reported on his troubles. A massive airstrike was brought in to hit Boko from 10 o'clock in the morning until dusk. American fighters came in every hour to strafe and SBD dive bombers to bomb the Japanese positions there. The Japanese retaliated in kind. At 4:30 that afternoon, a strong force of Zeros hit Inagi Inlet and the marine positions and damaged 1 PB. And that night, Washington Machine Charlie was back again. The battle for Barocco seemed to have reached a stalemate. The American troops in southern New Georgia were in disarray, and two men knew it very well. One was Inal Griswold, who was fighting time to bring in the new force that could move up to help Colonel Lived take Munda. The other was General Sasaki, whose pleas to Rabaul for an immediate major effort in the air and on the sea were going unanswered. The United States 169th Regiment was dawdling on the Munda Trail, cut off from the beachhead by the Japanese, and virtually encircled. One battalion actually was encircled. And with that the regiment's snail-like pace up the Munda Trail came to a halt. The Japanese ambushed the trail parties that tried to take casualties back to the Zanana beachhead. They whooped and hollered all night long like savages and cut the throats of the soldiers in their foxholes. On the perimeter, day after day, more Japanese troops infiltrated through the PT boat-infested waters of Kola Gulf to Barocco, and then trudged their weary way overland to the plantation encampment north of Munda, where General Sasaki's officers parcelled them out to the air areas where they were needed. Most a growing problem for the Japanese would be the lack of artillery replacement. Their system of resupply did not allow for much movement of heavy equipment, so they continued to be without anti-tank guns and howitzers for the troops of the line, but they had plenty of light and heavy machine guns, grenades, and heavy mortars, at whose use they were expert, and at least for the moment in southern New Georgia the Japanese had the initiative. What kept the southern situation from becoming a rout of the Americans was air support. Both sides were throwing as many planes as possible into the air to hit enemy land positions. But the Americans had more planes in the air. Dogfights were not as common as they had been during the old Guadalcanal days, when the American fighters went up to shoot at anything they saw. Now their major mission was to escort the bombers to the target and protect them from the Zeros. The Japanese were doing the same, except that they sent many more fighters in attempts to lure the P-38S and F-4U into combat. Their usual ploy was to lurk over Kola Gulf, simulating dogfights among themselves, in the hopes that they would thus seduce United States fighter pilots into the web. It did not work very often, as the fighter pilots began to obey Admiral Mitch's stern orders to stick to the business at hand, which was to blast the daylights out of the Japanese troops on New Georgia. One of the most exasperating efforts of the Japanese knees was washing machine. Charlie the troops half joked about the tiny sound of the float planes that harried them night after night, dropping a bomb here and there, but killing and wounding enough men to keep the joke from being funny. These night raids cost the troops sleep by night and cut their efficiency by day. The only weapon effective against them was the night fighter, but there were not enough of these to make the patrols up and down Kola Gulf and the Slot, and intercept the lone bombers. However, the night fighter situation was growing better for the Americans. The Navy had its Black Cats, PB equipped with radar for night operations, and the Army had P-70S, which were A-20 attack bombers fitted with a radar set in the nose, and 420mm cannons. These ranged above New Georgia in the night time, and shot down some of the washing machine Charlies. They were much more effective against the twin-engine Betty bombers the Japanese sent down on some nights. The American airstrikes against Japanese positions and shipping were sometimes effective, sometimes not. On July 17th, Admiral Mitcher had word of a large concentration of shipping at Bugville-Tonala Harbour, and he sent up a giant airstrike reminiscent of the Japanese strikes against Guadalcanal 6 months earlier. Up went 220 planes, including 4 engine B-24. Liberator bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers covered by 114 fighters. This time the situation was reversed. The American fighters protected the bombers while the Japanese Zeros tried to get at them, and then the bombers ducked under the fighting and tried to do their work. Their success was not enormous. They sank the destroyer Hatsuyuki, but not much else. But 2 nights later, the American air forces did claim prey. In a big way, the Japanese had sent another of their resupply missions toward Kolombangara that afternoon, and late at night a Black Cat discovered the convoy, which consisted of 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers under Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura. The convoy was so large because the Japanese had been frustrated in their last attempt to resupply the troops fighting on New Georgia, and they wanted to make sure that this one did not fail the 3 supply and troop-carrying destroyers headed in for Kolombangara shore and were chased and bombed by the night fighter, but without effect. But half a dozen bombers from Henderson Field attacked the cruiser-destroyer force and dropped 2,000-pound bombs from low level. They sank the destroyer Yugur with one direct hit and damaged the cruiser Kumano. Sure that his supply mission had been successful, Admiral Nishimura headed back home, leaving the destroyer Kon Army to rescue survivors of the sunk destroyer. But the next morning, 2 flights of B-25 bombers skip-bombed the Kon Army and left it sinking on July 22nd. The Japanese sent a routine reinforcement mission to the Shortlands. It included 3 destroyers laden with troops and supplies, and the SE plane carrier Nishin, which was carrying an artillery battalion and its equipment. American bombers caught the convoy in broad daylight in Banville Strait and sank the Nishin. With all that heavy equipment, the 3 destroyers made it safely to Bun, and the troops were moved down to the Shortlands by barge. There was nothing wrong with the Japanese method of resupply and reinforcement of the troops in the Central Solomons, except that it was far too costly in terms of destroyers and other valuable ships. The ineffectual attack launched by Colonel Liver's Northern Landing Force had left him short of supplies. But on the night of July 23rd, Admiral Turner sent up a large convoy, 2 cruisers and 5 destroyers, protecting 4 supply destroyers. They sneaked into Enaji Roads and managed to unload their supplies and take on the wounded without any more of an incident than the harassment of the landing by Japanese shore batteries on Kolombangara. Colonel Livard wanted more troops, but General Griswold was too badly bogged down in the south to give them to him. The fact was that both Americans and Japanese were operating on shoestrings. The American naval situation had improved marvelously since the Guadalcanal days, because the European war, which was paramount in the plans of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did not call for an American naval build-up. But the shortage of Allied troops was serious, because the European theatre of operations devoured divisions as a dragon devours maidens. The Allied combined Chiefs of Staff were looking forward to the Normandy landings of the following year, and this meant bringing 1 million Americans and all their trucks and tanks and heavy artillery over to England. There was precious little left for the Pacific commands, and the Japanese too were facing shortage at this point, mostly of ship and PLS, but later of troops as well. Their population base was less than half that of the United States. True, they had more men under arms at the beginning of the war, but most of them were tied down in China and Manchuria, and they continued to be just now faced with the problem of reinforcing the South Pacific. They were drawing on China, where over 1 million troops were operating, and the Kwantung Army of Manchuria, which numbered about 700,000 that year. Some units, particularly aviation, were moved in from China, but the Imperial General Staff was not inclined to strip these areas, which it considered to be far more important to bring reinforcements to the south. For these reasons, the South Pacific Campaign continued to be a limited war. Just how limited is indicated by 2 encounters between Admiral Holly and Captain Arleigh Burke, commander of a United States destroyer squadron. When Burke had come to the South Pacific, he had reported in to Admiral Holly, as did all senior officers in the office at the old Japanese consulate in New Maya. Holly had fixed him with those blue gimlet eyes of his, and given the captain a brief indoctrination. He did not care much about spit and polish discipline. What he wanted was fighting men and fighting ships, he had told Burke, and he did not want anything else. Burke had gone into action. He had led those 4 supply destroyers into Enagi on the night of July 23rd, so far from a real dockyard. His ships had quickly become troublesome, and the engineering gang had their work cut out for them to keep the vessels going at high speed. One of the destroyers in particular needed work, and equally the destroyer chores of the Solomons campaign needed every ship, and the men of the destroyers needed a break from the constant tension. But Holly was hell on anyone who came up crying, so the situation continued, until one day Burke, in desperation, simply sent his Runch destroyer down to Sydney without saying anything to anyone. At Numa, Hollies and Tenny were always out, and scarcely had the ship returned to base when Captain Burke was called on the carpet, and he came in great trepidation to Numa. Admiral Holly was sitting behind his desk with a black look on his face as the captain came in the door. He speared Burke with a glance. "Tell me, Captain, in the name of great thundering Hades, what business you had sending one of your ships down to Sydney without asking me." Burke fidgeted, but there was no way out. He summoned his courage. "Well, sir, he said we ran out of whiskey and beer, and the men he got no further. Hall's face cleared. He grinned, then he laughed. "Well, thank God," he said. "I was afraid you were going to say you sent her down there for repairs. And then I was going to have to berate you, so Captain Burke went away and about his business, which was to fight the Japanese, the battle for New Georgia. And that meant the airfield at Bua went on and on inside the Munda defense perimeter. The battle was beginning to wear seriously on the nerves of the Japanese defenders. Nearly every day they were bombed once or twice by dive bombers from Guadalcanal. American warships bombarded them at night, keeping the Japanese defenders short on sleep. By July 17th, 90 men had been killed by these attacks, and 636 wounded. Worse, more than 1,000 men were ill with fever and other tropical diseases. There were 100 cases of war neurosis. So a good part of the garrison of about 3,000 men could not be depended on for defence. Starting July 19th, the character of the American attacks changed notice. Ibly the attacks grew in intensity and length, and several times each day the Munda area was hit by 10 or 12 planes. Heavy bombers, dive bombers, medium bombers, and fighters General Sasaki realigned his defences. He decided to give priority to the attack on the American build-up at Zanana above all else, and sent a staff officer to inform Colonel Tominari that the 13th Infantry was to make a second attack, there on July 25th. The 13th Infantry was to assemble on the right flank of the 229th on July 23rd, and prepare to cross the Sho River and drive the Americans off the beachhead, all well and good. But on the evening of July 23rd, General Sasaki changed his mind. He called on the 13th Regiment to go into a defensive pattern, tightening its lines up against those of the 229th. General Saki seemed to have sensed that the Americans were preparing for a major onslaught, and this prompted him to change his strategy in midstream, a decision that brought considerable criticism by Japanese historians after the war. Having decided on a solid and aggressive stance at this point, General Sasaki seemed to have thrown judgment to the winds, and without apparent reason to have dumped his plan. But in one way, General Sasaki was quite right. The Americans were gearing up for an all-out effort against Munda. General Griswold was under enormous pressure to get the drive against Munda going. Again, he had to get that done in a hurry. General Harmon informed him so that they could go on to the next step, for the South Pacific operations of 1943 had been geared in with the Southwest Pacific operations of General MacArthur. The two commands had to share landing craft and destroyers and air support for their offensive operations. So it was essential that the schedules set down in March be kept as well as possible, and the New Georgia operations was far behind. Sasaki was again seeking reinforcement, and on July 23rd he sent a message to the 8th Fleet in Rabaul, asking for a change in the reinforcement pattern. He wanted the entire 2nd Battalion of the 235th Regiment to come to Munda instead of Barocco, and then the 13th Division operations area furthermore. Instead of having them fed in company by company, he wanted the whole battalion at once. The message was sent and received, but the junior officer on duty in Rabaul that night was not paying attention to business, and the message was never delivered to the command. So when the destroyers came down that next day to deliver the troops to the south, they dropped off only the 235th 7th Company instead of a battalion. It was to make a considerable difference in the defence of Munda somehow, possibly because of the bombing and the never-ending tension. Over Three Corner Hill, the company started out in the middle of an American artillery barrage, not having gotten the word that it was about to begin, but managed somehow to make it to the position, and there the troops settled in. They held off the enemy on July 25th. On July 26th, the Marines brought up 6 light tanks, and they attacked Three Corner Hill. The Japanese drove them off, and soldiers rushed out with grenades and satchel charges, trying to knock the treads off the tanks. If a tanker stuck his head up, it was liable to be blown off by a blast of automatic small arms fire, or he might fall back with a neat round hole from a sniper's bullet in his head. The ground had to be gained foot by foot, and the casualties on both sides were not negligible. 2 tanks were disabled, and the others grunted down the hill to reorganize. They started up the hill again with a much larger force moving along the south side of the hill. It soon became evident that that particular position could not hold out much longer, so the Japanese retreated where the 169th and the 172 had failed. The fresh and better-trained 148th Regiment gained ground, slowly supported by the Marine armour. The assault along the coastline was the hardest. The troops that had relieved the 169th to open the Munda Trail were in the position of flanking the Japanese defences, and their way was easier. The Munda defence was built around the 9 hills that protected the airstrip. The closest of these towering above the field was Bielo Hill, which commanded the airfield and the coastline on July 27th. The 148S advance units were within a half-mile of Bielo Hill. The Japanese called it Diamond Hill, but there the Japanese dug in and began a stubborn battle. By day the Americans passed over hidden pillboxes, and by night the Japanese came out of the pillboxes and fought their way to their own lines. They always left one man behind when abandoning a position, and he might cause a dozen casualties and hold up a unit for half a day until he was routed out like a mole. This was a new sort of fighting for the Americans, and it took some getting used to. It was unlike anything that had occurred on Guadalcanal. The Marines would get all the public credit for facing this sort of defence in the drive across the Central Pacific. It was unfortunate that General Howland Smith, who was planning the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, had not been exposed to this campaign in the Central Solomons. He was aware of the Japanese last-ditch stand on Atu Island in the Aleutians in May, but this Solomons campaign was in its way even more desperate and certainly much more effective from the Japanese point of view. One reason for the slowness with which information filtered out was a natural reluctance on the part of the American High Command to publicize their situation, for as of the end of July, the new Georgia campaign was anything but a success. The ease of the occupation of Renova had fooled them all, and now Munda was still holding out, and the whole drive north was imp-perilled with control of the air and a superiority on the sea that had not yet been seriously challenged. Admiral Holly was itching to get on with the invasion of Banville, a much more extensive Japanese base complex. But until New Georgia was in hand, there was no way Banville could be approached. As of July 27th, General Sasaki saw the end of his resistance in sight and warned Rabaul the enemy was steadily closing in on his positions. A patrol sent down to the beach area close to the American camp discovered that the Americans had relieved their pressure on the pillbox defensed positions on the hills for the moment, but a new attack on July 29th seemed to be mounting. His message to Rabaul indicated what to expect in the future: that the enemy moves more and more troops to the left flank of his main force in the Horsehoof Hill vicinity of the ridge line. Every day the bombardment increases as the opposition moves through the jungle. The losses of the 229th Regiment continue to increase. Present headquarters full force, about 20 men reserves, are declining also, but the fighting will continue to the last man. General Sasaki's situation was already hopeless, and he knew it. He sent regular messages to Rabaul, but he did not get replies. He was out of touch with Commander Saburo Okumura's Navy unit in the north, that was attacking the Americans from the other side, but which had now been badly chewed up by July 27th. General Sasaki could see that the loss of Munda, and that meant New Georgia, was simply a matter of time. The requested naval and air support from Rabaul had never materialized, and the Americans kept moving slowly but steadily ahead. The penetration grew so dangerous at the mountain pass in the Hanaya vicinity that General Sasaki detached a platoon from the 15th Air Defense Battalion down at headquarters and sent them up to reinforce the troops there. They did strengthen the defences, and the Americans tried hard, but failed to dislodge them. The two most heavily hit spots were called by the Americans Baibo and Singolo Hills. As noted, the Japanese had their own names: Diamond and Bombshell Hills, as of July 29th. The attacks seemed to be intensifying, but on the same lines as before, the Sasaki reports to Rabaul mentioned heavy artillery bombardment, with the heaviest attacks coming on the north and constantly increasing pressure. Then suddenly at dawn on July 29th, all the shooting stopped on the crest of Boar Hill. The enemy abruptly vanished, leaving some equipment behind. It was an enormous surprise and an opportunity for the Japanese to reinforce the various positions, but the rub was that there was very little reinforcement possible, because General Sasaki had gotten about 1/3 of the troops promised him, and a lot less than 1/3 of what he had requested. As of that date, Sasaki's strength at Munda was reduced to 1,200 troops. What was happening, of course, was that General Griswold was going for a final move, goaded by General Harmon and Admiral High. He had to move and move fast during the next 2 days. The Japanese abandoned some positions and strengthened others. The hills remained with their pillboxes, but inside the Japanese camp everyone knew that it would take a miracle to save Munda. On August 1st, the war on New Georgia Island started up all over again. With renewed fury, the Japanese had consolidated their defences and abandoned many points that could no longer be held. General Sasaki was not getting as much help even from Kolombangara as he wanted, for even before Sasaki saw the handwriting on the wall, the High Command at Rabaul had seen it and had begun diverting its efforts to strengthening other points, such as Buen on the southern tip of Banville. But Sasaki was getting some reinforcement, and he was determined to hold out and make the American victory as costly as it could be. Indeed, the entire South Pacific strategy had been turned toward delaying, and if possible containing the Allied drive. The Japanese Navy forces in the South Pacific were growing ragged, with the enormous responsibility pushed onto them. The 11th Air Fleet had lost dozens of Zeros and its best pilots. The drain on destroyers was constant, and the older ones were used when possible for ferrying troops and supplies. But some of the new destroyers also had to be pressed into this service. The result was serious disruption of naval combat operations in the area. The heat was on New Georgia, so resupply of the other Japanese bases was virtually unnoticed by the Americans. On July 26th, the destroyers Arikkaze Yugur and Hagikaze. The Rata Buen mission went like clockwork, and the 3 destroyers pulled into Rata Bay at 10 minutes past midnight on the 27th. And within an hour they had unloaded what they were leaving there and were underway for Bun most of the time. They were covered by planes from Rabaul and Buen, but that sort of air coverage could not always be managed, particularly down in Kola Gulf, where the fighting was growing hotter and hotter as far as the resupply missions for New Georgia were concerned. The most troublesome nettles were the American PT boats, which came out night after night to harry the Japanese. By the end of July, the Americans had more than 50 PT boats operating from 2 bases in the area. They were, or could be, quite effective against the barges the Japanese used to bring troops across from V to Barocco. But the PT boat captains liked to live dangerously, and they were forever on the lookout for Japanese destroyers, and sometimes they found them on the afternoon of August 1st. The Japanese destroyers Amagiri Arashi Haikui and Shigu set out from Rabaul with 900 more troops and 120 tons of supplies to try to tip the scales at Munda. They were instructed to move down through Wolf because a mission a few days earlier had used that route. Kola Gulf was just getting too hot, but the 4 destroyers moved in through Blackett straight without difficulty, unloaded their carros, and then headed home at 30 knots. It was a night so black the officers on the bridge could scarcely see the bows of their ships, just what was wanted to keep out of trouble. But trouble was afloat in the character of half a dozen American PT boats hanging around Blackett Strait, and V-Gulf among them were PT 159, PT 157, PT 109, and PT 162 lying in positions that might bring them into contact with this supply mission. The Japanese destroyers were charging along at what at least one of their captains considered to be totally dangerous speed in these narrow waters, when suddenly the command ship, the Amagiri, encountered a black shape dead ahead, and at 30 knots the destroyer smashed into PT 109, cut the boat in half, and sped on the following destroyers fired on the wreckage. The crew struggled in the water and tried to swim to land. Eventually, 11 members of the 13-man crew, including the skipper, Left John Fitzgerald Kennedy, were rescued through the efforts of a Coast Watcher Lieutenant Arthur Evans. It was just another unimportant bit of the South Pacific day's work, except that in this case it involved a man who would much later become President of the United States. As for the war at hand, the incident was almost entirely meaningless, and if anything tended to confirm the belief of destroyer and cruiser sailors that the PT boats were more nuisance than anything else. Admirals Merrill and Worth had standing orders that when their ships were operating in Kola Gulf, the PTs were to stay home. That was the result of the unfortunate incident weeks before when a pie boat had mistakenly sunk a crippled American ship. The small fries were a long time in living that down the PT boats could be effective when taking on opponents of their own size, and they did create difficulties for the Japanese resupply missions. For instance, one night in late July, 3 PT boats engaged half a dozen Japanese barges trying to reinforce Munda. They didn't sink any barges, but they did delay the landing and caused some casualties on July 29th during the recite in the fighting on New Georgia Island. Major General John R. Hodge replaced General Hester as commander of the 43rd Division, a post Hester had held as well as that of invasion troop commander. Thereafter, the Americans began to move much more smartly, but even with better morale leadership and increased number of troops, the going was tough. An advance of 1,200 yards in a day was excellent for the Japanese contested every foot of land around Munda one by one. The strong points fell to the advancing American troops. On August 2nd, the United States 43rd Division pushed across Lambetti Plantation and reached the east end of the airfield. General Griswold advised Colonel Liver's force at Onogi that he had broken the Japanese hold on Munda, and that many of the troops from the defence perimeter were now fleeing north. He asked that Liversedge cut them off. Livard was not in camp at the moment he had gone back south for conferences, but he was in touch with the battalion commanders by radio, and that night sent the troops of the 148th Regiment back to the roadblock. The increase in Japanese activity was notable as the Munda troops began filtering north. It meant more alerts and more sudden skirmishes, which usually ended up with a handful of United States casualties, a number of dead Japanese and some prisoners during and after the war. A myth persisted that no Japanese ever gave up wounded, or not, but the fact was that American intelligence officers counted about 700 Japanese prisoners of war during this campaign, most of them wounded so severely they were captured without knowing it, and so were in more or less constant contact with Japanese prisoners who were a primary source of information on.